Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the peaceful suburb of Maplewood, in the New Hampshire, the days pass slowly, like an old jazz record that you let play without ever wanting to stop it. The wind smelled of pine trees, and the seasons passed gracefully. Neighbors greeted each other as they walked their dogs, children still played in the alleys without fear, and Sundays were devoted to homemade cakes and quiet masses. Margaret Blake, 78, was a familiar figure in the neighborhood. Always wearing her hair in a neat bun, she often wore wide floral skirts and hand-knitted cardigans. Her house, a wooden structure with slightly peeling paint, stood on the edge of the Lac Willow, a peaceful mirror of water surrounded by 100-year-old maple trees. She had lived there alone since the death of her husband, John Blake, a decorated former Air Force pilot who died of fulminating cancer a decade earlier. From that day on, Margaret had locked herself into a simple, but rigorously organized routine. Every morning at 7:30, she prepared her jasmine tea in her Old English porcelain teapot, a piece inherited from her mother. She always placed it on the embroidered placemat in the center of the round table, between the jars of homemade jam and the framed photo of John, taken on their 40th wedding anniversary. The ginger cat of the house, Whiskers, slept curled up on the windowsill, warmed by the golden rays of a summer sun. The floral-patterned curtains fluttered gently in the morning breeze. An old record player played a soft tune from Nat King Cole, bringing a touch of melancholy to the tranquil air. Margaret glanced at her wooden wall clock, 9:12. Then everything changed. A deafening crash shattered the peace, the back door literally flew to pieces, throwing pieces of wood across the kitchen. The cat leaped away, knocking over a chair. The teapot fell from the table, shattering on the floor with a clatter of shattered china, a burst of jasmine immediately evaporating into the air like the scent of shattered memories. 3 men. Dressed in black, masked, gloved, heavily armed. One of them was already pointing an assault rifle at her, his eyes icy. "Stay calm, old woman," he yelled in English, with an accent that betrayed a foreign origin. He frantically rummaged through the kitchen drawers, throwing utensils to the floor without ceremony. The others scattered throughout the house, knocking over furniture, lifting rugs, opening cupboards as if they were looking for something very specific. Margaret, frozen, slowly raised her hands. She felt her heart pounding against her chest. Her breath came in short bursts. She hadn't felt this way in a long time, this rush of adrenaline mixed with pure fear. What are you doing in my house? Who are you?" she whispered, her voice surprisingly calm despite the commotion. One of the men ignored him. The other glanced at a map on his phone, pointed to a cabinet by the fireplace. She didn't understand. Why here? Why her? She had nothing of value. Nothing to steal. Nothing to hide. At least, that's what the world believed. Then, deep in his pale blue gaze, a spark ignited. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. A flash that only a careful eye could have captured. It wasn't fear. It was a memory. A buried, almost forgotten memory. The crack of a revolver in the GDR. The click of Morse code in the middle of the night. The thrill of a secret order slipped into a Berlin cafe. The chill of a mission thought to be buried forever. The gentle, unassuming Margaret the neighborhood knew had just faded away. And beneath his wrinkled features, Agent Blake was waking up again. No one in the neighborhood knew the true story of Margaret Blake. To the people of Maplewood, she was simply Miss Margaret, a charming old lady, once a military translator during the Cold War, a job title vague enough never to arouse too much curiosity. People smiled at this reassuring image, a quiet, cultured widow, fond of Russian literature, passionate about crossword puzzles and English tea. But this facade was only a mask, carefully constructed over decades. Margaret Blake had not only translated boring reports on communications between diplomats. She had been, in the shadows, one of the CIA's finest blades. His code name, Sparrow 7. A name almost erased from the archives. Only a few high-level agents, Langley and 2 or 3 members of the old Phantom Echo cell, still knew of her existence. They all knew that Margaret was not a simple analyst. She was a specialist in infiltration into hostile territory, mistress of disguise, polyglot, sniper, and above all, unpredictable. For more than 20 years, she had led missions classified as Black Level, the most sensitive of the time. In 1968, she had lived undercover in East Berlin, posing as the secretary of an East German cultural attaché. For 6 months, she had sent coded messages via tourist postcards, warning Americans of the KGB's movements. In 1973, she had survived an ambush in the Hindu Kush Mountains, in Afghanistan, while she was exfiltrating a Soviet scientist. Wounded in the leg, she had walked for 3 days in the freezing cold, her pistol in hand, before being picked up by helicopter. But the most significant operation, the one still being talked about in the most secret circles at Langley, had taken place at Prague. In 1981, a prisoner exchange had gone wrong. The American agent she was escorting had been shot dead in an ambush. Margaret found herself alone, surrounded. Rather than flee, she had used counterintelligence codes to turn a Czech agent against his own superiors, causing enough chaos to escape, but not before leaving a scathing message. Sparrow 7 never forgets. Her style? Direct, intelligent, never spectacular. She operated in silence, in the dark alleys, the corridors of power, the crowded trains of the East. She had known fear, pain, loneliness. She had loved only once, John Blake, her liaison contact in West Berlin, a major in the U.S. Air Force. They had married in 1984, after she had retired. In reality, she had simply chosen to disappear from the radar. When John died, years later, his whole world collapsed. Margaret then decided to bury everything. The weapon she had carried for 20 years? Locked in a briefcase deep in the cellar. Her old diplomatic passport? Cut in half. The code books? Erased line by line. She had sworn to herself to never dive again. Just become the old lady who feeds the ducks by the lake. She even bought a sweater and learned to bake apple pies. But the truth never stays buried for long. And that morning, as armed men ransacked his house, the past resurfaces. Not just in noises, gestures, reflexes. But in his survival instinct, in this icy clarity which came back at a gallop, like an old friend returned from the cold. She had been Sparrow 7. And maybe, she still was. The men were looking for something. No money, no jewelry. They ignored even the valuables visible in the house. Their search was methodical, surgical. They emptied drawers, removed sockets, and scanned the walls. This wasn't a burglary. It was a recovery operation. Precise targeting. Prepared. They had come for a hard drive. But not just any old one. A small, black, old military storage model external drive, format Cryptex, access to which required both a physical key and a biometric code. This disk contained a ghost copy of Project Sentinel, a file that Margaret had kept against all rules, at a time when she still believed she would one day have to take it out. She had hesitated to destroy it. But something had stopped her. A hunch. And now this intuition came back to hit her hard. We know you have it, Margaret Blake. Give it to us and all this stops. The chief's voice was deep, calm, almost courteous. The man had an identifiable accent, slave, slightly broken, too polite to be spontaneous. Probably a former GRU or SVR agent, now converted to mercenary work. Not an amateur. He didn't raise his voice, he gave ultimatums, not orders. Margaret didn't answer. More, his mind was racing. She mentally replayed the steps of an extraction. Terrain analysis. Access points. Security gaps. Composition of the enemy team, 3 visible men. 1 leader, 2 executors. Potentially a 4th on external surveillance. Communication via earpieces. Compact weapons. Silenced assault rifles. Definite military training, they had not come to negotiate, they had come to erase. And yet, something sounded wrong. If they had been mandated only to kill, they would have done so upon entry. But their insistence proved that they had need to locate the disc. They didn't know its exact location. They were counting on Shi to deliver it to them. Miscalculation. She turned her head slightly, staring the wall clock above the fireplace. 9h21. A specific piece of information springs from his memory like a Pavlovian reflex. Every day at 9:29 a.m., the neighborhood's community safety patrol, young, armed veterans, passes by her street. They change sectors at this time, and stop exactly 40 seconds at the nearby intersection to take a transmission break. This gave him 8 minutes. 8 minutes to disorient, gain time, counterattack, or disappear. Margaret felt the years in her joints, but military precision had never left his gestures. She knew these men underestimated her. They saw her as an old woman, overwhelmed, weakened, perhaps even confused. But what they didn't know was that Margaret Blake was never unarmed. Not really. And certainly not in his own house. She led them to the cellar. His voice, calm but trembling, had that feigned fragility that only very old actors know how to play. "That's what you're looking for." The leader nodded to his 2 henchmen. One of them nudged her lightly in the back, his finger tightening on the trigger. Margaret remained upright. She wasn't trembling. She was moving slowly, yes. But it was a calculated slowness. A mask. A trap. In the living room, she stopped in front of an old, threadbare oriental rug, faded by the years. Its patterns, once red and gold, had turned gray and brown. But beneath her feet, the truth was sleeping. She bent down, wincing slightly as if her joints were aching, and tugged at a loop of fabric invisible to the naked eye. A quiet click sounded. A trapdoor opened silently. The wood was reinforced, custom cut over 30 years ago. "Get down," ordered one of the men. Margaret nodded. She slowly descended the damp stone stairs, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The yellowish light danced on the walls. The cement creaked. A smell of polish, dust, and memory hung in the air. Downstairs, everything seemed frozen in time: stacked boxes of Christmas decorations, shelves laden with jars and books, an old workshop table. Nothing betrayed this woman's former life. Except, perhaps, the darkest corner of the cellar. There, half hidden behind an old suitcase and a cobweb-covered synthetic tree, was the black briefcase. Margaret approached it slowly. She crouched down cautiously. She blew the dust off the lid. The dull metal barely revealed an acid-etched, almost illegible inscription: Sparrow, 7, do not engage. She placed her fingers on the small fingerprint sensor. A short beep. The lock gave way. The briefcase opened. No hard drive. But much more dangerous content. Inside, perfectly aligned like a military rite. And Glock 19, greased, maintained, loaded. And Langley disabled access badge, serial number half erased. And a little one blackened leather notebook, yellowed on the edges, barely larger than a palm. Margaret reached for the notebook. She held it for a few seconds, as if she were hugging an old friend. Then she opened it again. On the first page, written in blue ink, was a date. Operation Orphan, 1983. The following pages: names. Coordinates. Access codes. Locations of formerly classified communications sites, things no one should own. Things that, in the wrong hands, could bring down entire governments. She closed the notebook and sat up. Behind her, the 3 men froze. She was no longer shaking. It was over, they thought. They were going to get what they wanted. But it was Margaretho spoke first. In a cold voice. Implacable. In perfect English, without a hint of an accent. "I don't know who you work for. But you came to die at my house." The chief raised his eyebrows. He barely understood what she was saying. Too late. Margaret turned around quickly, arm outstretched. 3 dry detonations, precise. The Glock roars like an old beast awakened after years of silence. First shot, throat. Second, heart. Third, eye. No waste. No mistakes. 2 fell instantly, like puppets whose strings had been cut. The third, hit in the collarbone, tried to raise his weapon. Margaret didn't hesitate. She fired a 4th bullet, cleanly, straight into the forehead. Silence. A heavy silence, filled with smoke, cordite, memory. Margaret breathed deeply, her arms still outstretched. She felt the weight of the Glock in her hand. Solid. Reassuring. As if all those years had never existed. As if Sparrow 7 had never disappeared. She looked at the bodies on the floor. Then looked up at the light bulb flickering faintly on the ceiling. At 9:32 a.m. the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The bodies of the intruders lay in the cellar, sprawled like mere shadows abandoned to history. Margaret Blake slowly climbed the steps. His legs, stiff but strong, now carried a different weight, that of the back. Not that of a hero, but of a ghost awakened by necessity. When she reached the living room, she scanned the chaotic scene, ripped open drawers, overturned objects, shattered mementos. Cold jasmine tea had seeped into the cracks in the parquet floor. Whiskers, the cat, was crouching under a piece of furniture, his eyes wide open. She walked straight to an antique chest of drawers, opened a drawer hidden behind a false bottom, and took out a small secure satellite phone, an obsolete model for ordinary mortals, but still activated for certain dormant lines. His fingers, despite the years, tapped a security code, then a 10-digit number. The receiver beeped 3 short tones. Then, a deep, unmistakable voice answered immediately. Kane. She had not even heard that voice for 15 years. She had aged, a little hoarser, more poised, but still upright, still present. David Kane, ex-agent of the NSA, who became a professor of cybersecurity at WITH, was one of the few still alive who knew the identity of Sparrow 7. He had been her technical superior, her confidant, her equal. At one time, he had even been something else. But they had each chosen the mission over the heart. Margaret did not hesitate. It's Sparrow 7. They're back. And silence glacial fell on the other side. Long loaded. Then. Where are you? At my place. But I can't stay. They weren't alone. I think they activated the Directive Zero. Another silence. But this time, adrenaline was evident in Kane's suppressed breathing. The Directive Zero, it had only been mentioned in extreme scenarios. It was the Total Erasure Protocol, when certain secrets, deemed too dangerous even for the United States itself, threatened to resurface. Independent forces, often paramilitary, subcontracted, disconnected from the official government, were sent to clean up everything related to it. Including witnesses. Including former agents. Including Margaret. Good blood, Kane breathed. Okay. Join the Point Charlie. Right away. No stopping, no detour. I'm waiting for you. Point Charlie. A name that belonged to another life. A disused listening post, lost in the mountains of Vermont, hidden in an abandoned ski resort. It was there that, 20 years earlier, they had deciphered the first data from the Project Sentinel. There they had decided, together, to bury the truth. But it was time to dig again. Margaret said nothing else. She hung up. Then she headed to the bedroom. In less than 5 minutes, she had changed into heavy jeans, a dark shirt, and a lined jacket. In a leather case, she slipped the black leather notebook, a handgun, an extra magazine, a USB drive, and a pair of gloves. She also took a photograph of herself and John, which she slipped into the lining of her bag. She took one last look at her house. Every wall held a memory. Every curtain, a fragment of peace. But the peace was over. Margaret Blake was no longer a grandmother. She was back to being Agent Sparrow 7. Not by choice. Out of necessity. And this time, she hadn't come to save an agent. She had come to Dodo bring down an empire. What the mercenaries were looking for was not a myth. Project Sentinel had indeed existed. Born in 1983, behind the opaque scenes of the technological Cold War, it was one of the most ambitious, and dangerous, surveillance programs ever conceived by American intelligence services. Officially, it was an experimental satellite designed to detect electromagnetic interference in space. But the truth was much darker. Sentinel was an omniscient eye, positioned in low orbit, equipped with a revolutionary audio capture system for the time, capable of intercepting any electronic communication, phone calls, radio signals, diplomatic transmissions, including those of allies. The satellite used a behavioral sorting algorithm, based on keywords, intonations, and linguistic patterns, to flag any potentially subversive speech. In short, a celestial spy, in the service of state paranoia. Officially, the program had been dismantled in 1991, after a series of internal scandals and the fall of the USSR. Unofficially, some of its components had been resold, diverted, or concealed. A group of former decision-makers, including intelligence agencies, military lobbyists and emerging tech giants, had decided to resurrect him, silently, under another name, Sentinel Rebirth. And one of the last copies of the original file, including the names of architects, the listening protocols, the evidence of violations of international treaties, was in a medium as unexpected as it was discreet. The locket Margaret wore around her neck. A simple, round coin with an antique design. A memento from her husband, John. Inside, his photo and a memory chip. Nano-encrypted slipped into the hinge. Invisible to the naked eye. A harmless, sentimental jewel. But also a political bomb. One of the mercenaries, in his brutal search, had tried to crush him under his boot. Bad idea. Very bad idea. A few hours later, in Boston, Margaret found David Caney in an abandoned warehouse near the port. The place was empty, dusty, filled with echoes. A cache once used for clandestine extractions. Nothing had changed there for 20 years, except rust. David had aged. White hair at his temples. A trembling hand. But his eyes were still as clear as ever. And full of questions. Margaret wasted no time. She placed the medallion on a secure tablet connected to an ancient cryptex reader. David typed in several manual codes. A green LED lit up. If what you say is true, then we have enough in this jewel to bring down towers. Silence fell for the 20 minutes the decoding lasted. Then the first file opened. Hundreds of pages. Thousands of lines of code. Names. Dates. Global surveillance plans. Internal correspondence between senior politicians and multinational executives. The real intentions of the resurrected program were clearly stated there. Create a comprehensive behavioral map of the population. Identify opinion leaders. Detect the beginnings of revolts. Provoke, manipulate, contain, rewrite. One page, in particular, freezes David's blood. Code name, Operation Mirror Field. Objective, to provoke fake citizen movements in certain strategic countries in order to weaken democracies hostile to American economic interests. Margaret closed the file. His face was calm. Grave. Now you understand why they reactivated Directive Zero. This program, it's more than a scandal. It's a weapon. They won't let anything or anyone stand. David looked at her. He knew what she was going to suggest. But Margaret wanted neither revenge nor a show trial. She didn't want to see her face on the front page of the newspapers. Nor did she want to receive a posthumous medal. She wanted the truth. Transmitted. Published. Above all, raw. So she made a decision. She entrusted the evidence to a young independent journalist, Naomi Carter, whom she had been eyeing for months. A tenacious, honest woman, with no political affiliation, and already threatened several times for her investigations into social media corruption. Margaret lured him to a safe place, handed him the entire file with a single word. "Don't believe me. Check everything. And when you're ready, publish. Even if it destroys you." Naomi Carter hesitated, then agreed. After the storm of revelations, missing Margaret Blake. Officially, the world learned a few weeks later that she had died peacefully of a heart attack at the age of 78 in a retirement home in New Hampshire. A sober ceremony, a few flowers, and condolences sent by neighbors and former Army colleagues. But in narrow intelligence circles, the truth seemed far more complex. Some whispered that Margaret had not left. That she had faked her death. That she had melted into the shadows she had always known, preferring invisibility to the harsh glare of the spotlight. According to these rumors, she was still traveling, discreet, furtive, between the ancient alleys of Berlin, the misty ports of Lisbon, the thick forests of the Patagonia. At each stop, she helped those who, like her, had been thrown to the margins of society after serving in the shadows. She reached out to them to rebuild a normal, human life. But she also didn't hesitate to strike when one of them crossed the line, betraying their code, jeopardizing the fragile piece of the world they had helped protect. At the CIA, at Langley, his memory did not fade. In a discreet corridor, away from the main offices, a small plaque was installed, almost hidden by a ray of sunlight filtering through the blinds. To the one who protected us in the shadows. And who knew how to fight even when the world had forgotten her. Sparrow 7. No one remembered exactly who had installed the plaque, or when. But it was there, like a silent tribute. A sign, a silent recognition for a woman who had been invisible to the eyes of the world, but not to those who knew. And in Maplewood, the wooden house on the shore of Willow Lake was now empty. The damaged shutters flapped in the autumn wind. The old, worn carpet at the entrance still bore the imprint of fleeting footprints. But one thing remained, true to time: Whiskers, the ginger cat, still there, perched on the windowsill. His green eyes scanned the horizon every morning, every evening. As if he was waiting for his mistress to come through the door. And in that look, a silent promise. Maybe Margaret would come back one day. Or perhaps she was already watching, invisible, in the shadows that no one saw.